The kind of silence that fills a hospital corridor at 2 a.m. is nothing like peace. It's the silence of held breath, of monitors beeping just softly enough to remind you something could stop. Alara Bowen had worked the night shift at Meridian Private Medical Center for 3 years. She knew every sound this building made. The particular groan of the elevator on the 4th floor, the way the break room coffee machine hissed before it finished brewing, the sharp click of Dr. Hartnell's shoes when he was running behind schedule. She knew these things the way she knew the faces of the patients in the VIP wing, quietly, completely, without anyone noticing that she noticed. That was the thing about being a billing coordinator at a place like Meridian. You were furniture, necessary furniture, the kind that kept the whole operation from falling apart, but furniture nonetheless. She moved through the marble corridors with her tablet and her sensible flats and her cardigan that she wore, because the AC never quite reached her corner of the building, and not one person in the hospital's upper tier ever looked at her twice. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and the kind of woman who got described as friendly and reliable by people who couldn't be bothered to learn anything else about her. Her dark hair was always in a bun. Her clothes were always clean, always practical, always in colors that didn't demand attention. She had spent years perfecting the art of taking up exactly the right amount of space. Just enough to do her job, not enough to make anyone uncomfortable. It had started as survival. It had become a skill. And on the night of October 14th, that skill saved a man's life. The VIP wing at Meridian occupied the entire top floor of the East Tower. 12 private suites, each one larger than most studio apartments in the city. Patients here didn't come for medical emergencies, or rather, they didn't come the way regular people did. They arrived in black SUVs with tinted windows. Their visitors signed non-disclosure agreements before they were allowed through the floor's secondary security checkpoint. Their charts were flagged with clearance levels that even some attending physicians couldn't access. Alara accessed them. Not because she was doing anything illegal. She was billing. Someone had to reconcile the accounts, and the VIP wing generated more revenue in a single month than the rest of the hospital combined. So she came up here 3 nights a week, sat in the small alcove beside the nursing station with her laptop, and quietly sorted through the numbers that everyone else found too complicated or too tedious to handle themselves. She was invisible up here the same way she was invisible everywhere else. The nurses nodded at her, the security staff knew her badge, and the patients, when they moved through the hallway in their expensive robes and their guarded expressions, looked directly through her. All of them, that is, except one. Room 1204 had been occupied for 11 days by a man named Luca Serrano. She knew his name the way she knew all her patients' names. From the files, from the insurance flags, from the careful way the nursing staff spoke about him when they thought no one was listening. She knew that he was 42, that he'd been admitted following what the intake form described as a workplace incident resulting in blunt force trauma, which anyone with eyes could have translated more accurately. She knew he was the kind of man whose presence rearranged a room. She'd seen it the first night he was there, when she'd come up to reconcile a disputed pharmaceutical charge and passed his open door. He'd been sitting up in bed, not resting the way patients rested, but alert the way a predator was alert, watching the doorway with the stillness of someone who had learned. A long time ago, that doors were where danger came from. His face was angular and sharp-edged. There was a scar along his jaw that had been there long enough to fade silver. His hands, resting on the blanket, were the kind of hands that told their own story. Knuckles that had answered questions people didn't want to ask. He'd looked at her when she passed. Not through her, at her. She'd kept walking, but she'd felt it. That gaze, direct and assessing, and somehow absent of the contempt she was used to. He'd looked at her the way you look at something you want to understand, 3 days later, the night nurse had mentioned, in the casual way that people mentioned things when they didn't think anyone important was listening, that Mr. Serrano in 1204 had refused his dinner tray again, and wasn't that a shame because the man was healing well and needed his calories. Elara, without fully deciding to do it, had taken a detour past the small family kitchen on the floor and made a cup of proper tea. Not the sad institutional bag they'd been sending him, but the loose-leaf tin someone had left behind months ago that she'd been saving because she never threw away useful things. She'd left it outside his door with a napkin. She hadn't knocked. She hadn't signed it. She'd gone back to her alcove and opened her spreadsheets and told herself that was the end of it. The next morning, there was a note tucked under her laptop bag. Thank you. Room 1204, that was all, but she'd read it 3 times. By the second week, she knew more about Luca Serrano than she'd intended to know about anyone. Not from his chart. She'd stopped looking at that after the basics, because it felt like trespassing in a way the billing numbers didn't. What she knew, she'd pieced together, the slow way, the way she pieced everything together. From fragments, from peripheral observation, from paying attention when no one thought she was. She knew that his men rotated in 6-hour intervals in the hallway outside his room. Always two, always positioned to see both ends of the corridor, never looking at their phones. She knew that the visitors who came to see him arrived in pairs, sat for exactly as long as it took to conduct business they conducted in low voices, and left without ever touching the fruit basket on the bedside table. She knew that the man who came every evening and stayed the longest, a lean, careful-looking man in his 50s that Elara privately called the accountant, because he had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to make himself invisible the same way she had, brought a leather folio every time and took it away again empty. She knew that 2 nights ago, the accountant had left looking different. She'd caught it only because she was walking past at the exact right moment, head down, tablet in hand. He'd passed her in the hallway without looking at her. He never looked at her, but she'd seen his jaw, the way it was set, the particular tightness around his eyes that she recognized, because she'd worn the same expression herself. The night she'd found a discrepancy in the hospital's controlled substances account that turned out to be embezzlement, and had to decide, alone, at her desk at midnight, what to do about it. It was the face of someone doing math they didn't like the answer to. She'd filed it away. That was what she did with things she noticed. She filed them. And then, on a Tuesday night in mid-October, she stopped filing and started calculating. It was 11:40 p.m. The floor was quiet. The charge nurse had stepped away from the station for her break. One of Serrano's guards had gone to use the restroom, a thing they staggered so that one was always present. But the timing had created a window of about 90 seconds, where the hallway outside 1204 was technically unwatched. Elara was walking back from the supply room when she heard it. Not loud, not a shout or a crash, nothing that would trigger an alarm. Just a voice, one she'd heard before, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that never needed to raise itself, because the words always landed, and another voice beneath it that she didn't recognize. She stopped. The second voice was coming from the service alcove at the end of the corridor, behind the linen cart, hidden, specifically, in the one blind spot of the security camera that covered this end of the hall, the one that had been malfunctioning for 6 days. The one she'd flagged for maintenance twice in writing, because it was her job to notice things like that. The one that still hadn't been fixed. She didn't move toward the sound. She moved toward the wall, pressed her back to it, slowed her breathing. The unhurried voice said, "Sunday, the transfer," while he's being moved, and the second voice said, "Calvo is already in position." Elara stood completely still for 4 seconds. Then she walked. Not fast, not slow, the exact same pace she always walked because a change in pace was the thing people noticed. Back to her alcove. She sat down. She opened her laptop. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her, because her heart was doing something complicated behind her ribs. She knew that name. Not from this floor, not from Serrano's chart. She knew it from a billing discrepancy she'd found 8 months ago, a ghost patient account, registered under administrative error, that had been used to route payments to a consulting firm that didn't exist. She'd reported it. The account had been quietly closed. She'd been told it was an isolated incident. She had not, privately, believed it was an isolated incident. She sat at her desk for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She knew because she was watching the clock in the bottom corner of her screen. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her cart, the one that contained her personal supplies, her tea tin, 3 pens, a granola bar, and a small notepad, and she wrote 4 words. She tore the page out carefully, folded it once, stood up. The second guard had returned. The first was back at his post. Elara walked toward them the way she always walked toward them. Without urgency, without hesitation, with her tablet in her hand, and her ID badge visible, and her face wearing the expression it always wore up here, which was the expression of someone who belonged, and was therefore uninteresting. "I need to check a billing item with Mr. Serrano," she said to the guard on the left, whose name she knew was Brody, because she'd read it on his contractor badge 11 days ago. "There's a pharmaceutical flag on his account. It'll take 2 minutes." Brody looked at her. He looked at her ID. He looked at his partner. "He's awake," the partner said, with a shrug that communicated this was not his problem. Brody knocked twice and opened the door. Luca Serrano was sitting up in bed the way she'd first seen him, alert and watchful. He was wearing a dark grey shirt instead of the hospital gown, because of course he was. The lamp on the nightstand was the only light in the room. His eyes found her immediately, and they stayed on her face the way they always did when she passed, direct, measuring, and quiet. She crossed the room. She set her tablet down on the rolling tray beside his bed. She pulled the small folded note from the front pocket of her cardigan and placed it beneath the edge of the tablet, where it would be invisible to anyone watching through the door, and she looked at him while she did it. His eyes dropped to the tablet, back to her face. He said nothing. She tapped the tablet screen, pulling up a wholly legitimate pharmaceutical invoice. She pointed at a line item and said, in a perfectly normal voice, "There's an inconsistency in the dosage billing from day 3. I just need to confirm the attending approved the adjustment." He looked at the screen. Then, with the deliberate movements of someone who understood exactly what was happening, he lifted the tablet slightly, retrieved the note, and held it below the edge of the tray, where neither the door camera nor anyone in the hallway could see it. He unfolded it. He read it. She watched his face. She had learned in 3 years of working on this floor to read people from very small movements. The tension at the corner of a mouth, the specific quality of stillness that meant calculation rather than calm. She'd gotten good at it. What she saw move across Luca Serrano's face in the 4 seconds he stared at that note was not fear. It was not surprise, exactly. It was something colder and more precise. The expression of a man who had suspected something and had just been given confirmation, and was now, very rapidly, reorganizing his next 12 hours around it. He refolded the note. He looked up at her. "Sunday," he said, very quietly. "Not a question? That's what I heard." She kept her voice at the same clinical register she'd used for the invoice. "I don't know the details. I know the name Calvo from a billing issue on this floor 8 months ago. I can't tell you if there's a connection. There is." His voice hadn't changed. It was still that same unhurried register, low and certain. He looked at her for a moment, the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, like he was actually seeing her. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, and you came to me because you were the only person in this building who's ever looked at me like I was in the room." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, just the very faint relaxation around his eyes, the way a face looks when it decides to trust something it already half trusted. He said, "Tell me exactly what you heard," she told him, quietly. Precisely, in the same even voice she used when she was explaining a billing error to an attending physician who didn't want to admit they'd made one. She told him about the service alcove, and the blind spot, and the name Calvo, and the word Sunday, and the phrase in position. She told him about the accountant's face 2 nights ago. She told him what she'd found 8 months ago, what she'd reported, and what she had quietly continued to notice since. When she finished, the room was very still. Luca Serrano looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "You could have left this alone." "Yes, most people would have. I know." He turned the folded note over in his fingers once. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. It had to do with the embezzlement she'd found and reported, and the quiet, sour feeling afterward when nothing had seemed to change. It had to do with the fact that she had spent years being invisible and had come slowly to understand that invisibility was a kind of power, and power had an obligation attached to it. It had to do with the fact that he had looked at her like she was in the room, she said. "Because I could." He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached for his phone. What happened over the next 20 minutes, Elara did not witness. She had returned to her alcove, opened her spreadsheets, and worked through 4 pharmaceutical audits with the focus of someone whose hands had things to do while their mind sorted through what they'd just done. She could hear, distantly, the sounds of a phone call conducted at low volume. Then another, then the particular sound of several people moving with purpose through the corridor, which did not sound like the usual rotation. At 12:18 a.m., Brody appeared in her alcove doorway. "Mr. Serrano would like to speak with you again," he said. This time, when she walked into room 1204, there were 2 other men in it, both standing, both wearing the same expression of careful attention that Serrano's people always wore. They assessed her and then looked away, which was a kind of invisibility she was used to, but that felt different here. It felt like being dismissed by people who were dismissing her on purpose, out of respect for something she didn't fully understand yet. Serrano said, from the bed, "I need to ask you something." "Okay, the man you saw in the alcove, describe him." She did. She'd already replayed the image carefully while she was working. She did this with things she wanted to remember, held them still and walked around them in her mind, the way you'd walk around a piece of furniture to see all its angles, average height, slightly built, somewhere between 45 and 55, grey at the temples, wearing hospital-issue scrubs that were a half-size too large, a detail she'd noted without consciously noting it, because things that didn't fit were the things she always registered first. When she finished, one of the standing men said something in a low voice to the other. The other nodded. Serrano watched her. The voice with him, the one you didn't recognize, younger, mid-30s maybe. He had a slight accent I couldn't place. East European, she considered. Possibly. I only heard 4 words. He nodded once. He said, "You'll be moved to a different department temporarily tonight. It'll be explained as an administrative reassignment." "I have work here. Your work will be covered," he said it. Without inflection, without apology, with the particular certainty of someone who did not say things they couldn't arrange. "I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to step back from the edge for a few days while this is handled." She looked at him. "Handled how?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Not in your hospital," he said. It should have frightened her. She examined herself for fear and found something more complicated. The particular sensation she got, sometimes when she found the thread in a billing tangle, when all the numbers suddenly aligned and showed her the shape of what had been hiding behind them. A kind of cold clarity, a satisfaction she didn't entirely know what to do with. "And Calvo?" she said. "Calvo," he said. will not be a problem by Sunday morning. She believed him. She did not examine why she believed him. She picked up her tablet, tucked the pharmaceutical invoice closed, and stood. Then I'll go process the reassignment paperwork. She turned toward the door. Ilara. She stopped. He hadn't used her name before. She'd never told him her name. It was on her ID badge, and he would have read it the first time she walked into a room he was in. Because he was the kind of man who read everything, she turned back. "What I said before," he said, "about you being the only one who noticed. I want you to understand something." He paused, and in the pause, he looked at her with that same direct, undeflecting attention that had thrown her off the very first time. "What you have, what you used tonight. I have men who've been with me for 20 years who couldn't have done what you did in that hallway. The watching, the pattern recognition, the knowing when to move and when to be still." He held the folded note up slightly. "This required more nerve than anything I've asked of my people in the last 5 years." She didn't know what to say. "You weaponized your invisibility," he said. "Do you understand how rare that is?" She was quiet for a moment. Her chest felt strange. Not uncomfortable, but full, the way a room feels when someone finally opens a window. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he nodded, and it was the kind of nod that meant dismissed in the way that actually meant respected. And she turned and walked out of room 1204 at exactly the same unhurried pace she'd walked in. She found out later, in pieces, the way she found out most things, that what she'd overheard in the service alcove was the final coordination of an attempt that had been in planning for 4 months. That the man in the 2 large scrubs was a former hospital administrator who had been providing access and intel for a faction within Serrano's organization that had decided, quietly and without announcement, to resolve a succession question through means that did not require a vote. She found out that Calvo, a name she had initially encountered as a ghost account on a billing ledger, was the intermediary between this faction and a rival organization, and that the Meridian connection had been the piece Serrano's people had been looking for and hadn't found. She found out that the reassignment paperwork she'd processed at 12:35 a.m. had moved her to the accounting department in the hospital's administrative annex, which was genuinely where she needed to be, and which also happened to be 3 floors, and a security checkpoint, away from the thing had become. Briefly and efficiently, very loud on Saturday night. She learned these things over the course of several days and several conversations that happened in places she wouldn't have predicted. A coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. A parking garage, once improbably in the hospital's own records room, where a man she recognized as one of Serrano's rotating guards sat across from her and answered her questions with the careful precision of someone who'd been told to answer her questions with careful precision. She asked him, Juanson's, who had told him to do that. He looked at her with an expression that suggested the answer was so obvious that the question was almost charming. She went back to her regular work. She processed her audits. She caught 2 more billing discrepancies, one of which turned out to be benign, and one of which was not. And she put it both through the appropriate channels, and was thanked in the vague, institutional way that indicated no one had fully understood what she'd found. She thought about room 1204 more than she thought was entirely sensible. 3 weeks after the night of the note, she was sitting in her alcove in the billing annex, back to her regular rotation, the VIP wing part of her circuit again, now that everything had been, as she'd been told, handled, when she heard footsteps she recognized. Not from their sound, exactly. More from the way the nurses at the station suddenly became very attentive and very still. The specific posture of people who were professionally capable and professionally aware that they were now in the presence of someone who existed in a different category of the world. She did not look up from her screen. Luca Serrano stopped at the edge of her alcove. He looked better than he had 3 weeks ago, still spare, still carrying that quality of coiled watchfulness. But the hospital pallor was gone. He was wearing a dark suit. He was, Elara noted with the part of her brain she had never successfully turned off, watching her with exactly the same expression he'd worn the first time she'd walked past his room. "You're back," she said. Discharge was this morning. He looked at her alcove, the cart, the laptop, the tea tin, the neat stack of flagged files. He looked at her. "I wanted to say something. You said it in room 1204. Not everything." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the corridor had achieved a very particular kind of noise. The sound of people doing their jobs very deliberately and paying no attention at all. "I'd like to take you to dinner." She looked up at him. He looked back at her with that same directness that had never varied, that had been the same on day one as it was now. "That's a significant change of scenery from a hospital billing alcove," she said. "It is. You understand that I'm going to notice everything about the restaurant. The sight lines, the staff rotation, the exits." Something moved in his face that was unmistakably a smile, small and not entirely comfortable on his features, like something that had been out of use. "I'm counting on it," he said. She closed her laptop. She thought about the years she had spent learning to take up exactly the right amount of space. About the particular art of watching without being seen. About what it felt like to sit in a room where someone finally looked at you like you were in it. And what you might become in the space that kind of attention made. She stood. "There's a place 3 blocks east," she said. "Corner table, 2 exits. The owner does a better job running his accounts than most of your medical staff. I've noticed it for a year. I've never gone in." He offered his arm with the formality of someone who meant it. "Then we go in," said Luca Serrano, and Elara Byrne, who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing, walked out of the hospital into the October night, visible entirely for the first time.